everyone and welcome back to another reading vlog. It is now September, which means that in my head it is autumn, and autumn is my favorite season of the year. So I'm ready for this. I'm ready for more time to hygge, more time for coziness. I could just keep on dreaming. This past week I have been watching the TV show of Sharp Objects, and I had to mention it here because I've become addicted. I'm now 7 episodes in. There are only 8 of them. My plan is to get home tonight after a birthday party and enjoy the very last episode. If you remember, I read the book last month. I reread it and really loved it, and I love how this TV show encapsulates the depressing and gory atmosphere that we get in this book. So just a shout out, I really recommend this TV show. However, I'm here to talk about a book which I read most of last month, but then I actually finished it yesterday, and that is Hunting Prince Dracula by Carrie Maniscalco, which is the sequel to Stalking Jack the Ripper, which I read a month or 2 ago. So this one follows the same characters but in a different setting, because in this book we are in Romania. This is, by the way, young adult, and it follows Audrey Rose, who is only about 17 years old. She is going to Romania to do forensic studies at Bran Castle, which is the castle that Dracula supposedly lived at. And when you do forensic studies, you basically carve up dead bodies in order to study them and find out what was the cause of their death. I like this book. I mean, these books in this series are great entertainment. I find that the first parts of the books are the strongest because that's when we get familiar with the setting, and in this one we have a setting of Bran Castle, which is a very dark castle that's got these dark corridors and eerie cellars, and Dracula used to live here. We've also got a forest with some very nasty wolves, and it's just a very creepy setting, which I was down for. But as the book progresses, it becomes very silly. For instance, these students, who are only about 17 years of age, they are told to carve up dead bodies that they actually find in the village during their stay, which in my head it's kind of silly, because normally you wouldn't ask for 17 years old to carve up acquaintances and people that they actually know. And also, wouldn't you like to inform the family first and foremost? They do with some of the bodies, but not with all of them. And the ending was just an adventure story, which I didn't really love as much as the beginning. So what I'm trying to say is I gave this book 3 stars. It is great entertainment if you are in for an eerie story, especially during these months in which the weather kind of drags you towards these gory kinds of stories. I'm actually kind of convinced that Zeus used to be Dracula in a former life. I mean, those teeth and that temperament and that angry face is kind of like Dracula. And I completely forgot to mention the most important part about these books, which is that they are historically accurate, so that we get photos throughout that correspond with the original myth of Dracula, and that goes for the Jack the Ripper book as well. It very closely follows the truth and the facts, and that's one thing that I absolutely love about these books. And also the main character, Audrey Rose, who is a very independent woman, even though she is living in the 1800s, and women weren't that independent back then. They weren't allowed to be that independent. So that's it, I'm done now. I just finished reading a book which I couldn't really place and rate while reading, but now that I finished it, I think I know how to rate it. Anyway, the book is The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell. It's a Gothic novel that is very eerie because it deals with a woman who is a widow, and she takes over this house, this mansion, which comes with some very creepy dolls, and it turns out that these dolls' eyes follow her whenever she moves around in the house, and they create disturbances in the house with the maids and with everyone living there, so that eerie things start happening and things get out of control. Some scenes in this book were definitely scary, but what had me wondering about my enjoyment of it was the fact that It felt a little bit long and a little bit too messy, but now that I have finished it, I get it, and I think I really liked it. So I'm giving this book 4 stars, even though I did mean to give it about 3 stars while reading, but it was indeed a really good and eerie Gothic novel. By the way, I forgot to mention that one of the best parts about this book is the fact that the very first chapter takes place in an asylum, and it's our main character who has been declared a maniac, a lunatic. She lives here and she is being consulted by a doctor who tries to find out what happened to her, and that's when we go back in time to follow her story. So we do know from the very beginning that our protagonist has turned crazy from these events happening, and that just adds a great eerie feeling to the story, I think. So today's Thursday. I just got home from work and it's been quite a week at work. So I was so thrilled to find this copy of Faithful Place in my mailbox. I ordered it last month and it's a book that I really want to read now. So I think that even though I'm currently reading 2 books, which I will show you, I need to start this one as well, because I really need this kind of crime story in my life right now. Something that I know I'm going to love and that I know will entertain me. And the 2 books I'm currently reading are The Overstory by Richard Powers, which I am finding very different and unique, but also very important. It's about trees. And that's all I'm going to say for now. And I'm also currently reading a non-fiction book about being a teacher. So this one is a new release. I am almost done with it, but I'm kind of saving it for when I'm in the mood for non-fiction. But that is also what I'm currently reading. What is happening out there today? Okay, that was the fire truck. But thank God for this book being in my mailbox. I really needed a pick-me-up. By the way, that's the last episode of Orange is the New Black running on my screen. Let's talk about this book, which is a non-fictional book about being a teacher, and it's not the most positive book you can ever read about this profession, but nevertheless I loved it. I gave it 5 stars, and let me tell you why. It's not because I'm a teacher myself and I could easily nod at everything that this book says. Like, I knew what was happening, I knew what it's like to be in this profession. Even though I'm not a primary school teacher, I still recognize a lot of the things that I mentioned. But the reason why I give it 5 stars is because I think it gives you a unique insight into this profession, what it entails, and if you have any curiosity as to what it's like to be a teacher, what you really have to do besides from teach, then this book is for you. Now, as I said, a very negative account, because this is actually about a woman who used to be a primary teacher. She used to love her job, she used to love the children, but I need to blow my nose again. It's one of those weeks in which this is my best friend. This teacher went down with stress because of politics and because of tests that every child had to do every second year in order to create numbers and make everything about quantity over quality. And basically it ruined her lust to teach, and it ruined her work life. She worked many hours each day besides from what she had to, and it's devastating to read. It really is. But it's also a very important read about how society shouldn't be based, or how our education system shouldn't be based on quantity. It's about the children and how they thrive and how they learn in the best way. I do really love this account. I feel like it tells the truth about the profession. I'm a high school teacher myself, so my students are much more independent than primary school students. But basically, I love this book a lot. I'm definitely going to lend it to my mother because she is a retired primary school teacher and I think she will really appreciate this book. So this one is going to her next. I didn't even have time for my coffee. Cheers. This one is caramel flavored. Yesterday I have a sore throat still, as you can hear. But yesterday I finished the second season of Atypical on Netflix and my heart, I think the second season was even better than the first one. So another very big shout out to that TV show in case you haven't watched it or even heard of it. I loved it. I thought I would also show you two books that I've been eager to pick up next, even though I am currently reading two books which I will finish first, but I would very much like to see myself pick up this book in the future. This is The Immortalist by Chloe Benjamin, which comes with very beautiful autumnal vibes, I think. And then all of a sudden last night I had an urge to also pick up this book, which I bought this summer and it's been waiting for me. I thought I would save it for come spring maybe, but apparently I'm in the mood for it now. It's a very chunky book, so I might change my mind by the time I finish my current reads. But for now, these are the two books that I am very much in the mood for. Now it's time for some breakfast and then it's time for work. Let's hope my voice survives today. Hi, Sus. Hi. So I'm still feeling slightly under the weather, but at least I'm getting better, which is great. I finished this book, The Overstory by Richard Powers. And can we just first take a moment to appreciate the fact that I've actually read this book, which is quite a chunker. It's 500 pages, it's heavy literary fiction, and it's about trees, but I finished it. I'm very proud of myself and I ended up really loving it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars and here is why. I think that this book is very important and I think that anyone who has read it will agree with me that this is one of those books that writes history, and it's one of those books that you will look back at in 50 years and be like, this book was one of the most important books out there. That being said, it was also a very difficult read, which had me conflicted many times. I kind of loved the story, but that wasn't much of a story. I was definitely intrigued by the storyline. This book has to do with trees. It's divided into 4 parts that form a tree. So we have the roots as the first part, then we have the trunk, the crown, and then the seeds. We also follow several characters which are introduced in the first part, and then we get to follow them as their destinies entwine, and in some way their lives surround around trees. I was also frustrated with this book because I found the storyline to be somewhat vague and messy, and I had a hard time understanding what was going on and also keeping track of the characters because there are quite a lot of them, and I felt like their names were kind of similar and I couldn't remember what had happened to that specific character I was reading about. So I was a bit frustrated, but the thing about this book is that the writing is kind of dense, but at the same time Richard Powers is definitely able to drag you in and compel you to keep on reading, because the stories that happen to these characters are fascinating. There are some scenes in this book that will definitely stay with me for a long time. And then by the time I reached the ending, I was becoming very frustrated because it was getting harder and harder to pick up the book, even though I liked it. And then I encountered a sentence that made everything clear to me. And let me just read it aloud to you, just because I find that this sentence is important when you go into this book. It's important to know, and I don't think it's a spoiler. I'm pretty sure it isn't, so I'm going to read it aloud now. She remembers now why she never had the patience for nature. No drama, no development, no colliding hopes and fears, branching, tangled, messy plots, and she could never keep the characters straight. That's the quote, and that was exactly how I was feeling when reading this book. And then I realized that Richard Powers was messing with my mind. It was the intention to make the reader bewildered, because that's what nature and trees are all about. It's about these messy branches and storylines that go in different directions, and it's hard to keep track of, but it's beautiful nonetheless. And basically, I ended up really liking this book. I gave it 4 stars, but I am very proud of myself for having finished it, because it's definitely a literary fiction book with a capital L. I think it's very appropriate that I'm now going to pick up this book, which has a beautiful tree on the cover. Look who we have here. Good morning, Zeus. Good morning. So this book that I'm currently reading asks a very interesting question of you and its characters, and that's the question: if you knew when you were going to die, the exact date, would you change anything in your life? I mean, if it's like in 2 years or if it's in 50 years, would that make any changes to your life and the way you live your life? I think that's an interesting question, and it's one that I've been pondering this weekend about my own life. I'm pretty sure that most of us would change things and do crazy traveling and just all the things you don't have time for, you feel like you don't have time for. But it's just a very interesting question, and also a very interesting story. Tana French's Faithful Place was a great book. I actually ended up liking this one slightly more than the 2 others in the series, so I gave this one 4.5 stars. And I think what really won me over was that in this one you really get close to Irish culture and Irish working families, which I enjoyed a lot. Just a great read all in all. This series is blowing my mind. It's pretty late for me. I usually don't stay up this late, even though it is Friday, but this week has been insane. However, I did want to talk about this book. I just finished this one before I go remove my makeup. What I love the most about this book is its premise, which I think I talked about in an earlier clip, so I'm not going to go into that once again. I will say reading the last part of the book was a bit uncomfortable, in that we have to do with animals and how they are experimented upon. I'm too tired to do this. At some points it felt uncomfortable, even though those parts also have their magical touches. So it was a bit slow to read this towards the end. I didn't feel compelled to pick it up as I felt in the beginning. I have to tell you that this one deals with 4 siblings living in New York, but then they grow up and we get to follow them as they go out into the big world and live with this knowledge that they have of when they're going to die and how it affects their lives. So yeah, basically I ended up really liking the premise of this book, and also the story in itself. I haven't given it any stars yet, but I am going to give it 4 stars. And another thing I'm also going to do is to go to bed right now, because I am simply too tired for this. Now, this book has been on my shelves unread for over a year, I think, so this feels wholly satisfying. Today is Saturday, the last weekend of September, and I'm having my sister over this afternoon. together with the family. I'm going to make them an apple pie just because it feels like autumn and I feel like making me some pie. So that is happening later. But for now, I want to talk about the last book I finished this month. That happened this morning, and I'm very happy to say that this book is my favorite of the year so far, and that's saying quite a lot. And the book is this beauty, The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. I knew of John Boyne because of his The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, but this was the book that ended up blowing me away. So basically, this book is set in Ireland in the 1950s. That's where it starts. We follow Cyril, who is a young boy, and we get to follow him as he grows up in Ireland and in a country which is very strict when it comes to pregnancy outside marriage and also homosexuality. He struggles a lot, and as a reader you can't help but roll your eyes at all of these rules, and also your heart breaks for Cyril and all the things that he goes through. So the narrative is told in parts, and for each part you skip ahead 7 years, which I thought was very interesting, because we get to follow him as he is a young boy, and he is kind of humorous and has an interesting take on life and an interesting perspective. And then we also get to follow him as he grows up and become his own adult and also an elderly man. I love these kinds of stories, but there was something about this one that took my heart and kept it. It's one of those books that I was happy to read, and I kept thinking about it whenever I didn't read it. So I don't think I have to say that I gave this book 5 stars. It is my favorite book of the year so far, and I'm so happy that I actually decided to pick it up and read it. Hi. Ooh. So I guess that's it for my September reading vlog. I will wish you a great October, or not. I mean, anyway, let's just wrap it up here. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this vlog and seeing a bit of Zeus down there. So I will be back again in October with my next reading vlog. But until then, have a great autumn, and as per usual, happy reading.